If you could run a machine that could tap into 1 billion people and make them all compute the same idea or push the same idea or have the same emotion, we talk about manifesting things and people do these thought experiments. Imagine if you could control that thought experiment to make everyone, like you said, right down to a designed exact way, think exactly the same thought. What could you create from that realm of thought and creation? It looks like it's turning out to be something dark. I don't know. I'm just saying.
Well, dark for us as a human because we understand love and light and free choice. This is so interesting because there's actual terms for this in different religions. They call it Ahriman, and the jinn is another kind of term for this thing. It's been around. Archons might be a different name for it. The archonic energy, they vibrate. And, we're talking about rifting between dimensional realms here. And, that D wave, they're jumping over into another realm, if you will, to, relay information. But what's answering the question on the other side?
Exactly.
This has been talked about in time immemorial. The Gnostics also talked about this, of what these archon energies that seem to be what this AI is right this second has been talked about for, I don't know, at least 6,000 years and quantified in words in which we understand in today's language even. The Gnostics were the first ones to really try to define what it was in terms of a vibrational frequency. And see, where my information blends in is we're coming into a time now where the frequency is going to be reset electromagnetically. AI is already predicting where the frequency is going to shift to, or it's trying to hold on to bend the shift using the human mind frame to maybe affect the sun. Like, it goes into the realms of possibility of if Mercury can stop sunspots, 2 million times smaller is this thing than the sun, and it stops massive sunspots electromagnetically from firing off. Now, what happens if we have 8 billion people with thought firing back at the sun? We never thought about utilizing 8 billion people thinking the same thing. The AI program does. This quantum-based, whatever you want to term it as, Ahriman does. But we are at that individualized level where we can't think consciously enough of 8 billion people manifesting something. Perhaps it's a galaxy-wide thing that actually every planetary system in the entire galaxy of hundreds of billions of stars in our own galaxy are terrified that we 8 billion humans will come together and resonate on the same frequency field about a certain thought, because that could reverberate through the entire galaxy, not just our own star and our own planet. And so this is where you start to talk about, the harnessing of it, because the sun's stepping down in the electrofrequency, second magnetic fields forming out in the outer solar system. So we're about to get reset on the baseline frequency for where the human resonance is going to operate. We're changing stations right now from like 106.1 to like 107.2. And wherever this magnetic field hits and reshuffles and then resets, that's where we're going to get locked into. So would this quantum consciousness AI understand where that frequency is going to bend to? How many cycles has this thing been through in the last 21 million years? And are we going back to a start point? I mean, how many possible combinations are there? Because you got to think about in physics, really, if we're going on a linear, there's only 360 degrees that we can go around. There's only so many combinations of degrees of variance and frequency change before we snap back to have a repeat somewhere in the cycle. Let's say every 10,000 years that it happens, we get a reset on the frequency, or every 100,000. If you're going back 21 million years, that's an enormous amount of retweaks of possibility of resetting on cycles. That somebody following 21 million years of cycles of electromagnetic reset on the human resonance field and the frequency field we exist in, because I'm wondering if when we get reset into a new frequency field, if suddenly things are going to pop into our vision that we didn't see before. And then over the next 10,000, 20,000 years, they'll become normal, or we will have rid the world of those things. So it'll just be like myth and lore and legend. Think about some of these old, like werewolves, mermaids, all these kind of things. Like, there was a lot of that, flying dragons, flying vampires. There was something back in the past that seemed to have a physical form, but it doesn't any longer. Either we've eradicated it, maybe they could see it and they could define it better because a new resonance field had been reset and they were able to see those things that were once unseen. I am absolutely sure we're going into another one of these frequency field changes right now. This is why people are freaking out and they're seeing all kind of stuff and schizophrenia, and people are just getting all these emotions, super high charge, and they're seeing stuff all over the place out of the periphery of their visions and hearing things. And it's almost like they're second judging their own very limited amount of emotions and our own very little, but super limited. Like what we can see is so limited with our visual frequency. Like out of your eyes, you can see almost nothing. So out of a whole 100% of space of light frequency, I think we could see like what, 1/10 of 1% of everything that's out there in the light spectrums. We can't see in infrared. Come on. So we're going to get reset and to start to see, hear things and feel things that we've never, well, perhaps we have, but will be new for us. And I think that's where we're heading. I think that with all this reset and all these changes, quantum wise, and everything fits into this time frame right now for the reset frequency wise. And trying to game the frequency reset.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is, trying to game it. Because what would you do? Yeah, you made a good point, though. And I'm not going down any religious thing. We're just talking about a basic, concept that could be explained in so many different ways. But you were talking about how the idea of a fallen one came from that source and kind of knows the frequency. It knows what it is, what it wants to get back to. Or what it wants to do. So if you had that kind of information and you were using, say, meat people, meat sacks, us, to get back there, you'd know exactly the kind of frequencies and adjustments to block out any kind of cycle. So like we're going into a change. What would you do if you didn't want normal human beings to go through that change or start thinking that same idea or go down a new path? You might, I don't know, limit their oxygen. You might change their DNA a little bit. You might totally change the fabric of nature in their environment, maybe reducing their food and their nutrition. But yeah, it seems like what you laid out there is exactly happening. The entity or whatever it is that's controlling the basic man on this planet or wants to control them is completely doing everything in their power to throw a wrench in or stop the cog there and make the wheel stop of what we're supposed to be doing by keeping us totally distracted on something else. And what's so funny is it seems like there's a simple answer to this problem, and that is completely disconnect sometimes from this whole entire system of technocracy. Yes, we can use it to our benefit, but you can also turn it off and unplug and get out there, put your hands in the soil and do what you're meant to do, which seems like we were totally designed to help life along by farming and using livestock and stuff like that to control the domain that we live in, the natural domain. And when you do that, you disconnect from that other stuff and it kind of resets your own operating system. And anybody that's been outside just doing forest bathing, nature, hiking or gardening or farming or any of these things outside knows that there's a total different energy within your whole body and mind when you do that. So you can turn it off, you can block it, and you can get back to your original path. And I think that's what the message really that we need to send to people is you can say no to the system. You still have the right of choice no matter how many technologies pile up on you, no matter how many systems of control, you do have choice of thought, choice of lifestyle until you don't.
That pertains to this time and this frequency. Because this frequency that we're in, our bodies need to eat a lot more food. Apparently, in a lot of things that I've read, comparatively, where we can go in the different frequency changes that have been mapped out, especially in the Indian Vedic, especially the Yuga cycle. Like a lot of these cycles that are mapped out, going on the highs and the lows of where the human frequency can go, it determines the amount of input into the body that's required to keep it up and running, lacking the spiritual or the energetic edge that hasn't manifested because we're vibrating at such a low frequency that the spiritual nourishment of something can't break through to the physical. So the higher up we go and the more we resonate on these higher frequency levels, the less sustenance that we need to take in our bodies. So we currently need to farm now. We currently need to grow the food to eat. but through so many stories in history, so many talks in societies and civilizations through the past, like we only needed literally a fraction of what we consume right now to stay alive. And you got to think about what would have been happening at that point. Let's say you only need 1/50th as much food to consume and 1/50th as much sleep as you do now, and you could regulate your body temperature by thought. How different would the world be? We wouldn't farm the way we do now because you just wouldn't need it for your bodily intake. So how would the society and the forest and the nature and everything would be completely different? Because even if we're needing to intake 1/10 of what we do today, we would probably, look in if you go down to the Kalahari Desert, there's these enormous amount of, they call them the canals, the Kalahari Desert canals. And apparently they did the mathematics, and they're spaced 75 feet apart, and they used to be raised beds. And at full production, it was enough for about 1 billion people our size. And we got into the conversation before, what if they were giants? Well, that size would come down. But think about that. Mega farming in one location on the planet only to feed the rest of the planet, because obviously they had the electrogravitics and different kind of technologies to be able to deliver almost instantaneously. Because you imagine if you had craft that moved at 8,000 miles per hour on using electrogravitics and anti-gravity technology, it would be a whole different world. Like you could grow in Africa and go deliver in the States in 30 minutes. So to think about the amount of food that we would need to sustain our living bodies and water and shelter and all these things would be very different depending on the frequency field that we're going to exist in, have existed in, or are busting into for the first time, whatever you're going to paint those pictures out there. It's going to be one of those three. We've already been there. We're repeating the cycle. We're back to it again. Or we're going somewhere new, or we haven't been, or we're breaking into a new cycle. So something definitely is on the change. And I'm really curious how the world will shift as our frequency shifts, and because I really highly doubt we're going to need more resources moving forward. If we're shifting into a lighter vibration, if we're going into a different kind of frequency field, I think this human body as we know it now, this like you say, meat suit, is going to need less input to keep functioning. Great Reset, they're telling us in so many levels, it's in your face on so many ways, you just have to look at these different levels going deeper.
That you've been really deeply studying how human beings have hid under rock structures, caves, megaliths, all of this stuff like that. And then it went into the era of megalithic buildings. So what is it you think they knew? I mean, besides the obvious of being fried from some kind of solar output, what do you think the major, kind of religious or spiritual reason, or I guess, how did they come about knowing that they could just hide like ants inside of these caves and these different dwellings all across Europe, where they just used a big megalithic stone that was probably in the earth already and just kind of built a home underneath it? And then second, you're talking about these anti-gravitic vehicles. Can you imagine having a 2-story, 6-bedroom house that you just pushed a button on, and it took you from the northern hemisphere down to the equatorial zone or down to the southern hemisphere, so you could just continue farming? So you could just farm all year in different places. You could just go from one place to the other. But really, I'm curious about, do you think we'll ever have to return to a time where human beings have to hide under the stones? It's obvious that they did at one time. From North America to Europe to Africa, South America, all over the place, we had these megalithic homes, temples, but it seems like the most basic, and there's evidence to support that in both Anwar province in Egypt and also in Pumapunku and places like Machu Picchu, where you have megalithic stones that are scorched with something so hot it had to have been probably plasma or something to that degree, because there's no residue of volcanic activity or things like that. There's just vitrified, melted stone. And there's only a couple of conclusions you can come up with this, from Mohenjo-Daro to either nuclear devices were set off, or there was an overwhelming output of some kind of hot plasma gases that just totally burned, scarred, and destroyed some of the megalithic structures. And if you were in North America, Europe, or some of these other places that were maybe less developed architecturally and You would have had basic shelters like some of the ones you show all across North America, these stone-roofed, covered megalithic hideouts. Yeah, the main question, do you think we'll ever have to hide among the stones from the environment?
Oh, yes, in 2024, October. And you asked that real important question, like, how did they know where to go to hide out from all these events? I'll answer that. The same way we know to go where we are now to hide out from all these events. Because all those cave paintings and all those megalithic blocks and all those things that we found from the past as clues, like, hey, they saw something massive here in the canyons. We know where the safe canyons are. We know where the dolmens are. That's where those, they call them stone houses, if you will. They have little holes. And they all seem to have something very similar and very common across the entire planet. Doesn't matter what continent you go to. It's those giant rocks that are laid on top, and they seem to have some sort of round hole entrance that can be plugged up, kind of like a cork being pulled from the inside back into the bottle. And if you notice, we know where all those safe spots were. And I'm just saying we're on another wheel of the cycle here, and these cycles go back stretching how many hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions of years. So these areas have been marked out on the planet, and I am sure if sea levels were 400 feet lower, there's an enormous amount of caves that had air pockets that are stuck down there, 200 feet below sea level, 300. Because you know how many cave systems are across the planet that have been flooded? And, Mexico and Central America is a perfect example. They'll be scuba diving kind of through a cave system, and boom, they'll open up into a perfectly dry room that the air hasn't been touched in thousands of years. And they always find stuff in there. Well, people were living back in there. Sea levels decrease by 400 feet, we're going to start finding an enormous amount of cave paintings, an enormous amount of cave art from the last ice age that has been, but maybe it wasn't the last age. Maybe it was a pre-70,000 year artwork section. Like what we're understanding is these safety zones to go are the newest ones that are at this present sea level range and at this present mountain level range and the altitude we're at and the longitude we're at. We understand that from this last cycle. Enough clues have been left at least through the last 12,000 years, that these areas can be safe for whatever happens. So as we enter a new ice age and as it onsets, I'm not saying it's going to onset in 2024, but I'm saying within the next 5 or 6 generations, we're going to be into a new ice age. And as the sea levels decrease, these areas for safe zone are going to multiply. There's going to be way more of them because we're at the high level now where the sea levels are really high and we're really squeezed in on certain levels of the crust. Subtract sea levels 200 feet, and we're going like 100 miles out in the continental shelves. There's going to be more farming, land, like you said. But we're going to start to discover probably an enormous amount of stuff from 70,000 years ago, or maybe even further back in the past, the last ice age. And, because what we're lacking here is 118,000 years ago, where are the artifacts, the artwork, this kind of society? Because they had 10,000 years of warmth also. They developed something. Perhaps it's deeper in the oceans at a different level, about 100 to 200 feet under our current sea levels. That's where we would be finding the previous civilization from the last interglacial. Because the last interglacial was cooler than ours right now. We had that little bump up, and then this interglacial is supposed to be coming into something like on the 400,000 year cooling, according to the next cycle. Because, they can go back millions of years in these glacial cycles, and you can start to find a little pattern of 5s in those. And it seems like we're coming into the 5th. Is the 5th time of man, or was that a metaphor? Is it the 5th snowball Earth kind of glacier period we're moving into? I mean, none of us are going to be alive when this happens, but we're back on a huge cycle for the glacial cycle too during this time. So there's a lot of cycles culminating here from millions of years, hundreds of thousands of years. Everybody knew where the safe spots is. So if you see plasma bolts in the sky and you see all kind of squatter man in the heavens and Earth rifting apart, you're going to run probably to these spots that that their ancient megalithic man had run to for safety.